Good afternoon. Another story from the world of Ogs. This one is one that I wrote in 2012. I went up to Gwydyr Forest in Llanrwst, I think that's where it is, in North Wales, and read a story to children in the Gwydyr Forest about a very famous person that lived up there called Dafydd ap Siencyn. Back in history, he was around, he was a bit like a Robin Hood character. So this story is trying to bring out some of the history of the area and the reason why the Ogs were able to release him and share with children bits about him. So I'm going to have him here. I tell you a little bit about the story, so if you haven't read any of the other Og stories, then it just makes sense. But I was reading this to a group of children and young people and parents to help them access the history of the landscape that they were exploring that day. Okay, so I shall start the story. Dafydd ap Siencyn and the Ogs. For thousands of years, the land around us has been changing. Sometimes we notice, sometimes we don't. The most important thing of all is to appreciate that we all contribute to these changes, like those who lived before us. We are all making history and making a difference. In the story that follows, I will introduce you to three sets of characters. First, the children, who were despairing at the dreadful weather one day in the summer holidays and at the amount of waste they had generated in their lives. Second, the Ogs, the Ogs, see themselves as environmental ambassadors brought here to help us explore the changes that have taken place in our environment over time. And third, Dafydd ap Siencyn, an outlaw and hero, and who did his best to protect the local landscape in the 15th century. I am just hoping that the Ogs can find him. Let us start at the beginning, in the craft room in South Wales. The children in the craft room were not to know that someone was listening to them as they told their mother of their worries about the freak weather outside. Why the serious faces, girls? It's the summer. It's the holidays. Cheer up, said Mum as she dropped a load of blankets and jumpers onto the floor. This weather is awful, Mum. It's supposed to be summer. And it's been raining and cold for weeks. It doesn't make any sense. Do you think the people on TV are right? Is it to do with global warming and stuff? They were always telling us about how we can slow it down. They looked at Mum as she dropped the clothes. Why are you putting those jumpers on the floor? These? Oh, they all need to be bagged up. They can be given to charity. Although some of them aren't good enough, I'll use those for dusters. But most will probably just get thrown away. See, look at all this stuff we waste. No wonder the world is falling apart. The children's faces had dropped and she could see the sadness in their voices. There must be something we can do with it all, Mum. The youngest of the girls looked out at the rain blowing hard on the window. I wish there was someone that could help us understand it and make it go away. Suddenly the pile of materials on the floor seemed different somehow. The arm of a jumper didn't look like an arm, but more like a trunk, and the blanket and the wools seemed to be suggesting they belonged together somehow. Whilst the children looked on in stunned silence, Mum picked up the materials and busied herself with an intense look of concentration on her face. Finally, she turned round and invited the girls to look. Do you remember? What is it? Mum, what is it? Out of nowhere, an indignant voice said, I am not an it. I am Mammoth, and we must get to work. There are others over there who need rescuing. So that is how it all began. Day after day, with the help of the children, Mum brought to life what was later to be revealed as the Ogs. Using the clothes piled on the craft room floor and those collected from other homes and charity shops, the team was completed. Mum and the children were exhausted by the experience and asked Mammoth, what happens now? Well, that is down to you. Tell us what's been going on, said Mammoth. The children had so many concerns that they wanted to share with the Ogs. They wanted so many questions answered about the changes they were seeing around them. They didn't know where to start, so they garbled it all out. The strange weather, the floods, the waste that was mounting up, the dog poo, the litter all over the place, the carbon emissions, the ozone layer. Everyone kept talking about the ozone layer. The list went on. Mammoth looked at the children and, seeing the despair on their faces, knew he needed to begin. He ordered them to find a means of transport, stating they would be moving out of the craft room straight away. When the children returned with the battered old suitcase, the Ogs all clambered in, and Mammoth told the children to close the lid and take them to their favourite place. so they took them to the beach. When all the Ogs were out on the beach, Mammoth told Mum and the children to leave them to settle. It was agreed that the children would not interfere, but would leave food parcels regularly in a safe place and visit if they had news to share. So that is what they have been doing. Every now and again, Mum would get a sign that the Ogs needed them or had something to tell them. The sign was usually a butterfly landing on Mum's nose, or something else odd, like a sheep walking into the kitchen like the other day, just staring at her until she realised and followed it down to the beach. Last week, when a butterfly had landed on Mum's nose while she was having a bath, she had tried to round up the children but couldn't find them anywhere, so she hurried down to the Og settlement alone. When she arrived, she was pleased to see everyone was accounted for and the children were already there. Mammoth invited her in and over and said, "I have decided we all need a holiday." "Oh," said Mum, "what's brought this on?" "The children have been telling us they want to know more about their Welsh heritage. They have asked me if I know anything about the famous outlaw Dafydd ap Siencyn. I have never heard of him, and the girls said they haven't been able to find anything down here, so we have decided we must visit his land." "Oh," said Mum. So that is what they did. The chosen destination was Gwydyr Forest, and after much huffing and puffing they arrived safely, although some of the Ogs had been too uncomfortable in the suitcase for such a long distance, so the children had taken them out and placed them on the back shelf of the car. Unbeknown to Mum, the children had told them that it was friendly to stick your tongue out at the driver in the car behind. You can imagine the shock on the drivers' faces. When Mum had parked up, though, and placed the Ogs in a good spot, Mammoth had asked them to leave, so Mum took them to see what they could find in this new land, whilst the Ogs settled themselves. When Mum and the children returned, they were all sat round a small fire, chatting. Howie was commenting on how pretty the place was. Eleanor had said how green it looked. Graham had said how hilly it is. Phoebe and Kenneth had said how quiet it was. Granny Annie and Bamperduck had just fallen asleep. Sylvie had said how lovely the air smelt, and Tom had commented on how rich the soil was, and Nana Peg simply said, "Where do we start looking for this Dafydd ap Siencyn?" Mammoth rolled his eyes and sighed. The Ogs looked puzzled. "What's up?" they all asked. "What do you mean, where do we look? We have our imaginations, and we have Mum and the children's creativity. We don't need to find him. We need to release him." Mammoth looked at Mum, who had returned with a bag of local fabric, and she smiled knowingly. She busied herself cutting and sewing. Before too long, there, standing beside the Ogs, was Dafydd ap Siencyn. He stood tall and addressed the gathering. "Who, may I ask, are you, and why am I here? I should be hiding. I am in great danger." It was Granny Annie who chirped up and said, "Young man, we are the Ogs, and I'll have you know that we've travelled a long way to meet you, and I am not terribly impressed with the tone of your voice." "Good day, kindly Ogs. I apologise, fair maiden." Granny Annie swooned at this. "I am tired and hungry, and I must hide. I must not be found by the Earl of Pembroke's men. They will kill me." With this, he ran off towards a cave and sat on the ground, looking thoughtful. "Killed?" exclaimed Granny Annie. "That's dreadful. Why would anyone want to kill you?" "My fair maiden," Granny Annie swooned again. "I have been hunted for many years because not everyone believes in our cause," said Dafydd. "We can hardly see you over there, fellow," said Mammoth. "Are you okay? I'm sure you are safe here." "Ha! I've been made very well. My colours are meant to hide me in the forest, to enable me to creep up on my foes. I remember the enemy thought we were fairies one time as we flitted from tree to tree." "Sometimes it was just me. So weren't you on your own in the forest?" said Phoebe nervously. "Sometimes it was just me, but mostly we were a band of men living in Carragawal Cave. Not all of us have survived the attacks." "Oh, my goodness," said Granny Annie. "What do you mean? Honourable men were killed." "But do not be afraid. I can protect us. I have killed many men who tried to stop us." There was a dreadfully loud intake of breath by all the Ogs. Mammoth then asked the pertinent question, "My good fellow, what is your cause?" "I fought for the House of Lancaster during the War of the Roses and played my part in Henry VII, the first Tudor king, taking the English throne. We burned down the garrison of our Yorkist enemies in Denbigh, which annoyed King Edward," chuckled Dafydd. "Henry was a fellow Welshman and proved a good ruler, but for a time it was bloody across the land." "Good gracious, young man," protested Mammoth, "could you not have worked all that out without fighting?" If us Ogs fought over things like that, we would be in such a sorry state, and no work would ever get done. And then where would these children be? Ha ha, you're so naive, my fluffy friend. One must fight for power and honour, said Dafydd. Did you not try talking to your enemies? Asked Graham, who thought talking made things better. Talking? Ha ha! Men did not merely talk about power. Power was to be seized and defended. There was a time for talking, and advisers guided rulers with talking. But when what you hear being talked about offends you, and you sense that control and order will soon be lost, then you must fight. Now enough of this talk. Where can I find myself sustenance? I must curb my hunger. Do you mean food? Tell us what you'd like to eat and we'll get it for you, said Eleanor, who was grateful to have a normal job to do. Whatever can be hunted in the forest, though my favourite was always wild boar, said Dafydd. We have some ham sandwiches and some Welsh cakes, so please help yourself, said Eleanor eagerly. Dafydd picked up the food and looked at it suspiciously, but his hunger soon meant it was history. With the exception of Mammoth, who went a little closer to Dafydd, the Ogs chatted amongst themselves, somewhat horrified by this character they had come to see. Then out of nowhere, Phoebe shouted across to Mammoth, Mammoth, tell him about us. Tell him that we are ambassadors for the environment and ask him... Phoebe, said Mammoth, why don't you come over and tell him yourself? I am sure he will not bite. Phoebe was not convinced, so she didn't move, but she raised her voice and said, Do you have any environmental concerns? Are you eco-friendly, Dafydd? Eco what? Said Dafydd. I think Phoebe is trying to find out a bit more about your life and how you lived and interacted with your environment. Is that right, Phoebe? Said Mammoth. Well, I just wanted to hear some of the nice things about his life rather than all that brutality, that's all. The others were listening now, and Graham said, Did you leave behind lots of rubbish and damage the ozone layer or anything like that with all your carbon monoxide and stuff? Dafydd looked confused. I've never heard about carbon monoxide, but with regards to what we left behind, we had to be very creative. Whether we were hiding in the woods or living in settlements, my people lived off the land, gathering, farming and hunting. We cooked on open fires, wove fabric and used animal skins to clothe us. We built houses out of natural materials and furnished them the same. We entertained with games and instruments that we had made ourselves. Perhaps we can find examples in this settlement now. There may be some in a museum, said the children. Probably, said Mum. Unlike our modern times, you lived a very biodegradable life, Dafydd, so it's hard to find remnants of your life. Just fragments of pots or arrowheads and pieces of spear, I think, have been found. Much has perished, and whilst this is sad for us, in one way it means you were a very eco-friendly society. Savage, maybe, but eco-friendly. Gosh, said Graham, do you think that is the payoff? A nation that is savage to people is often kinder to the environment. It was a different time, offered Mammoth. Remember, there were far fewer people around, and so they had less impact on the environment. I see, said Graham. So they were nice to the environment by accident. I suppose so, chuckled Mammoth. But they do not seem to have been nice to each other, said the children. Very true, acknowledged Mammoth. Why not? Asked Phoebe. Maybe Dafydd can answer that, said Mammoth. Dafydd looked around at expectant faces and thought for a few moments. Do people not fight any more? He asked. Unfortunately they do, answered Mum. Dafydd looked confused. So why do you think I was not nice to people? He asked. Because you have told us that you killed for power, and that does not seem very friendly, responded Phoebe. Friends and enemies should not be confused, said Dafydd. If you do not know the difference, then you will soon be dead. Great families joined forces during the War of the Roses, and this gave us power to fight our enemies. Do not great families still come together to fight for what they believe? Mammoth smiled. Indeed they do, but it is no longer great houses fighting for the throne. Money, land and power are still things that some desire, and unfortunately this can lead to battles and pain. However, there should always be room for talking, to find ways that we can make this work and live together. What do you think of yourself as? Asked Kenneth, who up until this point had been quietly observing the conversation. Dafydd thought for a moment, then said, It depends on who you ask. Fellow Lancastrians would say I was a friend. King Edward said I was an outlaw, though he did grant me a pardon and I became constable of Conwy Castle. I don't know, really, anymore. I thought I was doing what was right for my people. But did anything good come from it? I don't know. Can you see any signs of me here? Did I leave a mark? Are there signs that I made a difference? Oh, goodness, all these years of fighting and killing, for what? Was I a bad person, Phoebe? Mammoth? Now, Dafydd, don't fret. You are part of history and stories of you continue. People are here today because of the likes of you. You followed a cause and during your time battles were the way that crowns were often won. People travel far and wide to find evidence of you. People have come today from all over the world to visit the spur of Dafydd ap Siencyn in St Grwst's Church. And there is a sculpture of the spur here in Gwydyr Forest. And let's not forget Sir John Wynne of Gwydyr, who wrote about you in his diaries. Now that is very interesting, said Graham. We record things in our diaries that we find interesting too. We really are very similar in some ways, aren't we? All of a sudden, Mum released one of Dafydd's men and his horse from the fabric, and Dafydd turned to his old friend and said, Gwilym! Gwilym! I am so pleased to see you. Mammoth, look, it's Gwilym. Do you remember that time they thought we were fairies in the woods? Ha ha! Come and meet my fluffy friends the Ogs. They're environmental ambassadors, you know. Apparently, we too were, I think. It is here that we leave the Ogs to Dafydd and the Ogs listening to Dafydd and Gwilym, remembering the days when Dafydd shot an arrow through the window of his enemy to steal his pie. As you can see, the Ogs lead an exciting life. It is these interesting findings that they record in their Og Diaries, and I hope you too are recording interesting findings and stories in your diaries too. If you'd like to get in touch to hear more stories, then please just keep keeping an eye out for the posts and follow me on Facebook, Francine Davis Art. Okay, thank you very much.